Before we get into that, I want to actually go back to the last class where we were talking, and it'll all make sense, I promise. We were talking about Oscar Lewis and the culture of poverty, or different ways that people have tried to explain inequality in the US and globally. And I referred to Oscar Lewis's culture of poverty as possibly the worst idea in the history of US anthropology. At the end of class, we'd run out of time to discuss this, but at the end of class, Silas jumped out and started yelling at me. Well, maybe not literally. Something about culture and being poor. What do you remember what you said? Why were you upset? No, I don't want to get on the bus. If I see somebody get on the bus, I'm like, why don't you get a car, man? Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I agreed with you because I did skip by habitus. Didn't have time to talk about habitus, and I want to talk about habitus because in some ways habitus is Bourdieu's answer to culture. But the reason this is the worst idea is not necessarily because of the idea itself. So I should explain myself. The idea that you have a different cultural norms based on your social class is almost indisputable. It's actually very true. So we should talk about class and the culture of being in a certain social class. My problem with the culture of poverty, though, is that if you just say it, it's not so much how it sounds in a classroom or when you're reading about it. It's when you use it out there in the world. It's when you talk to people in, say, government, or when you're having a political election and you talk about people that are in a culture of poverty. Because if I say, well, let me put it to you this way. If I said, man, I was down in, what's our nearest city? I was down in Binghamton, thank you. And man, some of those people are in a severe culture of poverty. What are the images that come to your mind? Culture of poverty, Binghamton. The people at Walmart, a bunch of weird stuff starts popping into your mind. And you start thinking, man, those people are stuck there. They can't get out, and they're in this culture of poverty. We'll never be able to help them. And look where they are. If they just bought the right shit and didn't buy this other stuff, maybe they'd get out of their culture of poverty. But boy, they're just, what are they buying there at Walmart? Everything and all the wrong stuff. Or you now like you drive around some, let's say you go over to people have commented on this. Let's say you go over to a place where people live in trailers. What are you likely to see outside of those trailers? Toy cars. Those toy cars. Yeah, you'll see those. And you might also see some really cool looking cars too. And what do you think when you see that cool car and a guy living in a trailer? You're like, man, if you just spent your money on a house, you'd be much better off. So we have this idea that there's a culture of poverty and that people are stuck in it. And so it's not necessarily that the idea is bad, it's that how it is used is bad. And so, yes, we are then talking about Bourdieu over there in France and his idea that education actually doesn't help people necessarily get out of their social class. It in some ways reinforces whatever class they're in. But what you're trying to do when you get an education is attain that cultural capital so that then you can go to a person's house with a bottle of wine and be like, hey, I fit in here. And you can rise up in the ranks and have some of that cultural capital. Does it work? Who knows? But Bourdieu was talking about in this book called Distinction in English, how your social life, your manners, he talked about things like holding a fork and knowing which thing to know when you go to somebody's house. Not only you have to bring a bottle of wine, you have to know if they set out the napkins, you have to know which thing to use in the cutlery if you go to a dinner party. Actually, what do you do? Let's say you go to a meal and there's 3 spoons and a couple forks. What do you use first? Oh, you saw this from the Titanic. Okay, good. Yes, the Titanic is a good movie to watch for gaining cultural capital. Yes, start from the outside and move in. There you go. Bring a bottle of wine and you'll be all set. So, Bourdieu was very interested in this, and he talked about this thing that we skipped over, which is the idea of habitus. The problem with Bourdieu, and I don't know if it's because he's speaking in French and it's just badly translated into English, which is possible, or if because he's just in his own Bourdieu world, is that nobody could understand what he was talking about. So he called the habitus This is a definition for you. The durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations. Got it? No, this doesn't make sense. Anybody want to take a try at it? It makes sense in French, I tell you. Actually, I don't tell you because I don't speak French. The durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations. Actually, here, let's go on. The habitus, history turned into nature, i.e., denied as such. Does that clear it up? Jeopardy question. Jeopardy gives you the answers. You're supposed to give me the question. What is habitus? Yeah, that would be good if I said that there was a Jeopardy game where I said the durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations, and you buzzed in and said, what is habitus for 200, Jake? Yes, got it. Oh yeah, that's a 500. Actually, it's one of those bonus rounds where you bet it all. Definitely 500. Here, let's go on. Or go back. The most improbable practices are excluded as unthinkable, or at the cost of the double negation, which inclines agents to make a virtue of necessity, that is, to refuse what is anyway refused and to love the inevitable. Anybody got it yet? All right, so let me try here. What Bourdieu was trying to deal with was the fact that when we think of the word culture, we often feel like it's determining us. And so we feel like it has become a word that is used, as we've talked about, it basically became used in place of a word that stood in for what people used to think about race. And so people would basically take all the things that they thought about race as determining of how lazy you were, how smart you were, and they just put it onto culture instead. And so culture became this determining trap, I would say, where people felt like, oh, if you are in a certain culture, then they always do this, and they have these certain kinship rules, and they have these certain marriage rules, and they have these certain rules about how much you can work, or what you call your dad, or something like that, and you're just stuck in this culture. And so what Bourdieu is trying to do is to give us a sense, because if you actually look at those first two lines, you could say that that is culture, actually. So let's actually look at the middle part. History turned into nature, i.e., denied as such. So we talked about how culture in our world is all of our learned behavior that we learn in a particular place, but it becomes so natural to us because we just think that's the way it's always been done, that then it doesn't feel imposed, it's just natural. And so that's what he's saying here. Now, what is the difference between habitus and culture? Not necessarily anything. You could probably say culture here, but what he's trying to get at is how people get this history turned into nature, but are still able to take actions in the world. And so you are still trying to do things. You're trying to go to that dinner party. You're trying to make different choices in your life. You're trying maybe to change your social status or move up or sideways in the world. But you do it within a structure which you may not even realize. And so that's what he's talking about in that first sentence. You have a durably installed generative principle. That I would say is all the cultural norms that you have of regulated improvisation. So you're still making choices, but they're being shaped by the way in which certain things have been durably installed in your outlook. And so when you think about social class, for example, and whether you're going to get on that bus, whether you're going to get on a bus or not, you've made a choice to get on the bus, but that comes because of a certain predisposition, you might say to that. That's the durably installed generative principle. And so then the last part is really important for how, for example, people from, say, working class backgrounds may not even consider going to like a really good, let's say, an elite school. They might have all the smarts, but because they would feel out of place there, or because they're not going to make that choice. Now, what he's saying is here, the most improbable practices are excluded as unthinkable. So if you're in, say, a working class environment, that isn't even part of your thinking. You're not like, oh, I wanted to go to Harvard. That's just it's out of your unthinkable, or at the cost of the double negation, which inclines agents to make a virtue of necessity, that is, to refuse what is anyway refused and to love the inevitable. So what he's saying is, yeah, people are making choices, but they're being limited. And so they're either going to not make a choice because it's excluded as unthinkable, or they're going to say, yeah, virtue of necessity. That's what I wanted to do. Harvard sucks anyway. Much better off here in my hometown, just chilling out. I would say that when I look around sometimes at, say, people in this area, it's sometimes surprising how close people are to home. When they go to school, they're right here. No offense to anybody. Some of these other places, you're getting on planes and going all over the world, and here we are. So again, what Bourdieu is trying to get at here is a sense of culture that doesn't necessarily determine people. So this is why, yes, being in a working class or a wealthy or a middle class culture comes with all kinds of cultural stuff, but how is that reinforced over time without us portraying it as a determining trap? Are you less angry now, Silas? Does that help or not? All right. I want to keep going a little bit with Bourdieu. Sometimes Bourdieu is better or easier in a diagram. Now, it's so hot in here again. Turn on the air. So again, some big words here, but we can get a lot out of this diagram, I hope. Let's just say that you're having an argument or a debate. And so what he calls this is the world of opinion, where you have the orthodox, which would be the received wisdom. That's one side of the debate. And the heterodox, which is the new position. What we might call in this country, or it used to be, the conservatives and the liberals. That's one side is trying to supposedly, although that thing has all been messed up now, but supposedly the conservatives are trying to conserve the order as it is. And the liberals are trying to change things. Like I said, this seems all backwards now, but that's used to be the way things were. So the orthodox are committed to their way of life, and the heterodox are trying to shake things up a little bit. And this is the world of opinion. This is where people have debates. When you go on and you see two people debating each other, they're going to take two different sides. One is from the left and one is from the right, let's say. And so that is what he calls the universe of discourse or argument or debate, things people are talking about. But there's this whole behind the scenes thing, which is the universe of the undiscussed or the undisputed, what he calls doxa, which are basically the assumptions upon which this debate can occur. All the things that make it possible that nobody's talking about in the debate sphere, but they're just assumed to be there. They're not being discussed. I believe that the purpose of going to college is to give us insight into all the things that you don't get discussed in normal society, the things that are underlying the debates that we have, the doxa. And so I'm not very interested in opinion debates in college. I'm not very interested in having a debate about, I don't know, what's something people are debating right now? Are people debating that? Yeah, so I'm not so interested in debating that. What I am interested in is this underlying doxa that we had an election at all. That's we assume we had one, but where did that idea come from? So we could get up here and have an argument, but that's not really the purpose of college. You can go out and do that on your own. We don't come to college for that. You don't pay big money to have an argument about opinion. You can do that on TV or wherever, on TikTok. But on doxa, that's what you come to college for. That's the good stuff. Let me give you an example. My example is same-sex marriage. So if we rewind back to 1955, 1950s, let us say, where does same-sex marriage fit on my little Bourdieu's diagram? If I were talking to you in the 1950s, where does same-sex marriage fit? Andrew, what does that mean? Is that where it belongs? Yeah, you would have been heterodox if you came in and said, I'm advocating for same-sex marriage in the 1950s. Would that have been heterodox? It wouldn't have even been on the horizon because that wasn't even a debate. It was assumed that marriage was never, ever going to be same sex. The doxa was simply that marriage was between man and a woman. There was no debate about this. There was no debate about same-sex marriage. It was actually only until, say, I don't know, 70s and 80s that yes, it does start to come in as a heterodox opinion. And when it starts to come in, people are like, no, I don't like that. And so there was the orthodoxy which reacted to that. As late as Barack Obama in the 2000s, he said he was opposed to same-sex marriage. And it was actually Biden who broke him up on that and said, came out in favor of it as his vice president. Barack's like, okay, fine. But the point is, at the time, even in the 2000s, this was a debate between orthodox and heterodox. But before that, it was just part of the document. It would be unthinkable to have same-sex marriage. It wasn't even be part of the realm of possibility. It was just not even up for debate. One of the interesting things about same-sex marriage is one of the reasons that it became such a huge deal was because of healthcare benefits and being employed in the way we have healthcare in this country. If you weren't married, you don't have any healthcare benefits. You don't have any insurance benefits. You don't have any inheritance benefits. And so oddly enough, if it wouldn't have been for the weird structure of American healthcare, this thing might not have been such an argument as it became. Now, I would argue that in your generation, or at least in parts of your generation, and maybe this is changing now since everybody's up in arms about the election, but let us say that it used to be that if I asked you about same-sex marriage, would you have a debate about that? Why are you looking at me like that? How many people do you think would get mad?
I'd like to think it's small.
Yeah, it got pretty small. I don't know what's going on out there today. I'm not the youth. But my opinion was that for at least for a moment, maybe for a few years, maybe this isn't true anymore, same-sex marriage became doxa. It was like you wouldn't even, why would you debate that? Everybody accepted that. If you even dared to say you were against same-sex marriage, you'd probably be thrown out of, I don't know, thrown out of your dinner party. You wouldn't be able to bring that bottle of wine because they'd throw you right out of the house. So it became doxa for a while, and it may be that it is entering back into opinion. So I like to play around sometimes with this Bourdieu diagram about what gets discussed and what gets undiscussed or accepted. So let us say you lived in a society in which very few things were debated. It's a very small list, and pretty much everything else was assumed. Nobody really talked about it that much. They just went on with their lives. So you have a very small sphere of debate and a very large sphere of the undiscussed, or doxa. What would that society be like? Or what might you call such a society? Lots of doxa, little debate. Yeah. It could be an authoritarian society and people are they don't want to debate very much, or the sphere of debate is very limited because you don't even dare. Like it could be an enforced, right, an authoritarian society. So that is one possibility where everybody is just doing their thing and nobody even dares enter the sphere of debate because if you enter it, you might get booted out. Is that the only option? Authoritarian. I agree that is an option. What other societies might this pertain to, or a vision of other societies? Very homogenous. Yeah. To use a word that I don't like, but I mean, we would think about this as a traditional society where not much is being questioned. People are pretty much agreeing. Every so often, somebody raises a question, but for the most part, everybody is just agree with what's already been agreed with. How about this society? Very little is agreed upon. Everything might be debated. You walk out the door, you might be getting in an argument with somebody. You never know. It's like you're walking down the street, you come in anywhere, and people are fighting each other all the time. Every so often they get along, but for a little bit. What's this society? What would it be like to live in this society? Or let me put it to you this way. Which one would you like more? This society or this society? You like this more? Even if it's authoritarian? You'd like it if it was a nice authoritarian. A traditional society. We'll call that the nice authoritarian. It's nice to live in a society like this if everything is nice, as long as you're not too much in this society.
We already live now.
This is exhausting, right? It's exhausting because you want a little more doxa in your life. You want a few things you can do without fighting each other. That this is, it might be a necessary place for a society to be in, but it does tire you out after a while. Let me ask you this. Do you think the United States is more like this or more like this? What is that? Why do you think it's more like this?
Oh, you mean like, okay, I get what you did. There's two extremes.
They're falling off the doxa. In the olden days, it used to be this, whereas which people agreed, okay, I'm going to read this newspaper or I'm going to watch this television show, the news, and then I'm going to have an opinion on it. But now it's like I got my TikTok and you got your TikTok, and they're telling me totally different things, and we don't even agree on what the facts are. We don't even agree on what the doxa is. As I was telling my family, the whole idea that democracy is on the ballot, you can't put democracy on the ballot. People will vote down democracy every single time. Democracy has to be the thing that we agree upon. If it's on the ballot, nobody likes it. You know why? Because in democracy, nobody gets anything done. It's better to be in this society where somebody's getting stuff done. Yes, it's better for us to be in a democracy, but if you put that on the ballot, then you're going to lose. Sorry, democracies were never voted in. They were imposed upon people. If people got to vote on it, they'd always choose a king. Almost always, historically speaking. It's weird. Yeah, I know. If you had taken a poll of the United States when it was becoming the United States, of all the people who actually live there and just did an election, we'd still be a colony. All right, that might be an exaggeration. But the people who were in various ways, for example, the indigenous populations that felt like they might have it better under at least some protection from the colonial rulers. This happened in many Latin American countries as well. As soon as they declared independence, they just ratcheted it down on the indigenous populations. And the enslavement became worse after independence. So the people who were here, they might have been, at least we have protections under the Brits. If we give it up to George Washington, these fuckers are gonna crush us, man. Maybe an exaggeration. No, I'm not a loyalist. I'm just saying that if you look back in time at most European countries and the United States that became democracies, it wasn't because the people voted in a democracy. It's because they established it and then everybody had to follow the rules. So democracy has to be this. We have to at least agree upon what a democracy is.